Thanks for joining us for another edition of Divorce Today on DadsDivorce.com. I'm Stephanie McCracken, your host, and today we're going to be talking about a little bit more about a children's perspective on divorce. And joining us today is Dr. Debbie Huntley. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and also a professor of psychology at Argosy University in the Twin Cities. So, Debbie, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So just tell me a little bit more about your background and how you've come to focus on divorce and children's perspectives and everything like that.
Sure. I've got my PhD in clinical psychology, but I specialized in children and families and did some clinical practice with that group. My dissertation and thesis were on single parents and how that affects the development of children.
Okay. So can you just help us understand how a child is impacted by divorce, and kind of also focusing on is it a child affected differently, by their age or if they're male or female?
Yeah, that answer used to be simpler 30 years ago, and it's become a more complicated answer as we learn more. The easy answer was that, yes, kids are affected by divorce, and in particular you might see things such as anxiety, depression, oppositional disorder, acting out disorders, impulsivity, and then as they became adolescents, trouble perhaps in forming intimate attachments, and as they became young adults, continued difficulties in forming attachments. While the general literature says that's still true, we realize now that there's a lot of factors that play into whether that occurs or not. And there's very much an overlap between kids from divorced homes and kids from intact, which is to say kids from divorced homes look a lot more like kids from intact homes than they don't.
Okay. What can we expect from kids during the time when you as a family are going through divorce, and what can be considered normal behavior for kids during these changes, and what could be considered a warning sign or signs that you might need to seek some outside or professional help?
Well, research also says that if you are a very young child, and I'm going to say 0 to 3,
okay,
you may not see a lot of things happening at that age. There's still an attachment to the mother that probably is stronger than the attachment to the father at that age. And to be able to continue with the mother may mean that there's not a huge amount of difference in that child's life if the mother can continue to be an effective parent. If the mother is really disrupted by the divorce herself and is having her own issues, and the family lifestyle changes drastically, then of course that would impact the 0 to 3-year-old. The kids from school age, and I'm going to say 6 to 10, are probably going to go through more anxiety, depression, and acting out, and I would consider that to be normal.
Okay.
And especially within the first 2 years, I would consider that to be normal. If it becomes a level of significance that it interferes with the kid's ability to function at school or in peer relationships, then obviously, whether it's because of the divorce or not, the children need some help. They need some intervention. What we see, though, as I mentioned earlier, in adolescence is that they're going to have more issues with relationships. And there's this sleeper effect, which is that kids in the first 2 years have this negative effect of going through the divorce, and then it tends to look okay, except for adolescent girls who then later down the road show up as having problems with, again, connecting to a partner, having a relationship. And there's also some evidence that they may engage in promiscuous behavior at an earlier age because they again have this lack of normal development in understanding relationships.
Okay. You're talking about that sleeper effect that you were discussing. Is there something that parents can do to kind of counteract that and be proactive before it's even shown up? Or is it pretty much is it kind of hard to understand how it proceeds in adolescent girls?
Well, it seems as though if the girls are having a situation in which the mother divorces, they're with the mother, and then they go into these relationships themselves as adolescents and young adults, there is going to be somewhat of an impact, but it can be lessened if the mother is, again, healthy herself, if she is if the daughter is able to maintain a relationship with her father that is healthy, if the mother and or the father involve themselves in other relationships, they remarry, then they divorce again, the more times that there are transitions in the lives of her parents, probably the greater the effect is going to be on that daughter.
Oh, okay. Now, when you're first going through the divorce, how can you best communicate with children about divorce and the issues that may come up? What do you include them on, and what do you kind of keep them safe from?
Well, you always want to remember to be age appropriate, and you also want to remember that you're a parent and there are boundaries around your relationship with your spouse that don't include your child. I guess what I would ideally like to see is that the parents practice first before they talk to the child about what they want to say. They jot down some notes about how they want to communicate it, choose their words, and then they come together as a team and say, this is what's happening, this is what it means, this is what we plan to do, but we'd like your input. In other words, I think if the child can have some control and say how they'd like to have things happen, but without feeling the burden of making decisions that adults should make, or without being put in a position to feel like they're choosing one parent over another, then I think that is probably a healthy way to go.
Okay. Do you have any sort of tips on how divorcing parents can help their child cope with the feelings that they may be feeling, or they might not even realize they're feeling? How help them work out their frustrations and issues?
Well, I think one of the things that plays a role in how kids are going to adjust to the divorce is how well the parents get along.
Okay.
That's actually true before the divorce occurs as well as after the divorce occurs. So if parents are able to come together and not relate to each other in a really hostile, angry manner, that bodes much better for the child.
Okay.
I think making sure that if both parents are competent parents, that the child has access to both is also going to be really, really helpful.
Okay. So, as we're discussing this, and, there are obviously some ways that divorce can negatively impact children, but it's not always negative, is it?
That's right. Most children end up doing okay. I mentioned that 2-year frame as when children seem to have a little bit more difficulty, but after 2 years, children seem to look like they're doing okay again, unless there are some other circumstances involved. The majority of children who've come from divorced homes end up looking much similar to those kids who were raised in intact two-parent homes. So it's not to paint a bleak picture, but it is to say that divorce is a stressful situation. It can have an impact, but I think also parents can do something to help that so that it doesn't become, a negative situation.
Is there any other type of general advice or ideas you'd like to share with our audience that might help them if they're going through a situation where they're either starting off and going through a divorce, or they're kind of right in the middle of the situation? Any advice for them?
I do have some more advice. Thanks for asking. I want to make sure that parents don't put kids in a position of taking sides. That's really difficult for the child. Even if that's not your spouse, your wife, your husband any longer, it is still the child's parent and will continue to be. So when you can, say something positive about that the other parent. I also think trying to keep the child's life as much similar as you possibly can. Transitions are really, really tough. They're tough when you're young, perhaps more tough when you're young. But when you're adolescents and you have peers or a job or whatever, transitions are tough as well. So to either keep transitions to a minimum or at least get some input from the child as to how to do that would be helpful. Also to remember that you are the child's parent, not their friend. Don't confide in them and don't look for emotional support for them. That's a burden that, especially in younger children, it's very overwhelming. Remember that, I guess, finally, that this is still a loss for the child, even though it might be a place where the parents feel like they're going to a better, into a better relationship or a better situation for themselves. The child will still experience that as a loss. And most children, even those children whose parents argued and didn't have a good relationship, will still say they wish their parents did not divorce. It's a very difficult thing.
So thanks again for joining us for another edition of Divorce Today on DadsDivorce.com.